Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just wait 30 seconds or so to let everybody sign on. Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. This is our second consultation webinar on our proposed 2021 registry fees for Blue Box materials and hazardous and special products, or HSP. We hosted another webinar yesterday. And so this is our second and our final webinar. You also may have joined us earlier this spring for our webinars in consultation period on 2020 registry fees for tires, batteries, and electronics. So this is kind of our second phase of this 2021 registry fee consultation. The fees for tires, batteries, and electronics have been approved and posted. So that, and you can see all the consultation process history on our website if interested. Today, we will be outlining the proposed fees for Blue Box materials and hazardous and special products. We'll also be going over the authority's revised 2021 budget and the allocation of program costs. We also will be answering your questions and also seeking your feedback. So we will be pausing several points throughout the webinar to answer your questions. To ask a question, if you can click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the text box and then click send. There's also an upvote feature where you can like another person's question. And what this will do is move that question up in our queue. So, it comes to the top of the list and it will prompt us to answer that question faster. So if there's a question that you see from another individual that you really want to hear the answer, or maybe you were just about to type in the same question, feel free to give it a like. And again, that will just bring more attention to it and move it up in our queue. If we can't get to your question for any reason, and if any of you are joining a second time and were here yesterday, there were quite a few questions that we couldn't get to just because of time and the amount of questions we received. We will be posting our Q&A log following the webinars. Will likely be in the next week or so. That will compile all the questions that we received and provide answers for all of them. And we will notify you when that has been posted. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will also be posted to our website as well as the slides. That should be later today or tomorrow. Next slide, please. Quickly, just to go over the agenda. We'll start with doing a bit of an intro about the authority and who we are. Hopefully this will be helpful for those of you who are new to us. Then we'll spend some time on our fee setting methodology and what goes into setting our fees. Next section will be speaking to the fees themselves, so the proposed registry fees for Blue Box and HSP. We'll take a quick pause there for a feedback poll. We're just looking for your feedback and thoughts on our consultations and how we can improve them going forward. And then quickly follow up with the next steps and how you can submit your feedback and ask any additional questions if needed. And as mentioned, throughout there will be some question and answer periods sprinkled through. With that, I will hand it over to Noah Gitterman, our Registrar and General Counsel, and he will lead the presentation. Thanks, Noah.
Hi, everyone. I'm the registrar. I'm going to be walking through the presentation. A lot of the material I'll walk through today was included in what was posted on our website when we launched the consultation. There are a few new or different slides that I'll spend some time on. I'll try not to spend too much time on things you might already know or might already have heard. So there's time for questions. Why don't we get started? Next slide, please. So we almost always start these fee consultation webinars with a bit of a description about the authority, who we are, and what we do. Especially with this consultation, we've got two new programs, Blue Box and Hazardous and Special Products, that we're implementing this year and that we'll be paying fees this year. And so it may be helpful just to for folks on the line to provide a bit of a background about the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. So you'll hear me referring to us as RRCEA probably throughout most of this presentation. So RRCEA is a regulator that has been created by statute and mandated to administer the regulations under the RRCEA, the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, and the Waste Diversion and Transition Act. And so the Waste Diversion and Transition Act outlines or contains the legislative framework for winding up and transitioning the legacy waste diversion programs in the province. And the RRCEA contains the framework for the new waste diversion programs under the producer responsibility model. So the new framework under the RRCEA requires producers to be individually accountable and financially responsible for their products and packaging once consumers dispose of them. And that framework sort of becomes reality through the individual regulations that the ministry develops and the government approves. So we've got, right now, we've overseen the transition to the RRCEA of the used tires program under the tires regulation, and of the batteries and electronics programs under the batteries and electronics regulations. And of course, there are two new regulations for two new programs that were released last month, Hazardous and Special Products and Blue Box. Next slide, please. Maybe a little bit more about the two new regulations we have. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. You'll probably hear me refer to Hazardous and Special Products as HSP throughout. Both of these regulations, although different in many respects, both of them require obligated parties to register and report to the authority through our registry. So our registry is an online platform that allows the authority to securely and confidentially collect information from obligated parties, to monitor performance and do our compliance work, and to report out publicly on performance. The creation of the registry is a statutory obligation we have under the RRCEA, but it also serves business functions for us for compliance and enforcement, and an interface for registrants to give us the information they need to provide under the relevant regulations. For HSP and for Blue Box, registration and reporting in 2021 We will be using a modified approach because we just received the regulations in June. We won't have developed a full online registry, but we will be creating templates in Excel that will be made available for users, producers, and service providers in order for them to be able to easily give us the registration and reporting information. So a bit of a different process in this first year of the rollout. Eventually there will be an online portal for Blue Box and HSP, just like there is for tires, and just like there will be for batteries and electronics sometime next month. So for batteries and electronics, that program rolled out or was launched towards the end of 2020. That also used this sort of alternative method of reporting into the authority using templates that we provide as an alternative to the full online system, which we're developing right now and we'll be launching for batteries and electronics in a few weeks. Blue Box and HSP will have to wait a bit longer. Next slide, please. Because we're talking about fees, it'll be helpful to talk a little bit about our finances. So RRCEA is an administrative authority. We are not part of government, although we're accountable to the ministry and the minister, and we do not receive any government funding. So all of RRCEA's operations need to be funded through fees that get charged to regulated parties, and those fees are our costs are recovered on a cost recovery basis only. So the fees we charge out can only be used to recover our costs for the waste diversion programs. So we operate under two statutes. Under the WDTA, we assess monthly cost recovery charges to the IFOs or ISOs that operate the legacy WDTA programs or in the course of winding up. Under the RRCEA, we set and collect annual fees that obligated parties or registrants are required to pay us when they either first register or do their annual reporting to the authority. The RRCEA registry fees, they cover our costs for all of our operations running the programs under the RRCEA, and the WDTA monthly charges cover our costs for overseeing IFO and ISO programs and their wind up and transition. There are, under the RRCEA, there are some rules in our statute about how we set fees. In particular, we're obligated to consult on fees for 45 days. So that's what we're in the middle of right now. So we launched our consultation a few weeks ago. I think the consultation period, if we haven't told you the date already, it'll come up again later in the presentation. The consultation period lasts for a few more weeks. And then we're also, once fees are set, we're obligated to post them for 30 days. So in order to support the registration reporting for both Blue Box and HSP this year, we're consulting now, and we're aiming towards setting these fees sometime in August. Next slide, please. So we took a bit of a different approach to our 2021 fee consultation this year. It's actually proceeded in 2 phases. And part of the reason for that, or the main reason for that, was that We didn't have the Blue Box and HSP regulations yet, but we needed to set fees for the tires and batteries and programs so we could start getting those programs, getting the registration and reporting for those programs underway, or at least well along in the preparation. So we've actually already set the fees for the 2021 registry fees for tires and batteries and electronics. During this consultation, we're proposing the fees for Blue Box and HSP registrants. We're also showing sort of the full budget allocation among all the programs. So that's something we couldn't do when we set the tires and batteries and electronics fees, because we didn't have all of our programs when we set those fees. Now we do, because we have the regulations from the government. And so we're able to show our estimated budget and how we're allocating that budget across all of the programs. So for tires and batteries and fees were actually set, if you were listening in on those consultations, and the final fee that was posted, those fees were set based on last year's fee. So to the extent there is a difference between the revenues that those fees generate and what needed to be collected under the budgets we've now allocated, that'll be trued up when we set 2022 and 2023 fees. But there's a similar concept for all of the programs that we set fees for, because we set fees based on an expected budget and based on assumptions about how much revenue those fees will bring into the authority. So there is always a true up at the end of the year based on the actual budget, the actual expenses, and the actual revenues that we received. And so to the extent there's any surplus or deficit, we try to minimize that as much as we can. But to the extent there's a surplus or deficit, that gets carried over into the following years. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a bit, you can go on to the next slide, Isabel. I'm going to talk a bit about the fee setting, our fee setting policies and methodology. In 2017, the authority developed and consulted on a fee setting policy, which is on our website, that outlines objectives and principles guiding the development of fees, as well as methodology for how fees get set. We are currently reviewing the policy and methodology, and we'll be consulting with all of you again when we set 2022 registry fees about how to update those documents to reflect the structure of the fee proposals that we're currently pursuing. So you'll hear more about those documents when we set or start consulting on 2022 fees, which we hope will happen later this year. Next slide, please. So some of the objectives set out in our fee setting policy are on the screen. Transparency about the process, reasonableness of the charges, and ensuring that they reflect the costs we're actually incurring, financial sustainability of the authority, that's RRCEA, is a key objective. Fee predictability is a key objective, and something that we hope to improve on as the programs mature, and fair allocation among fee-paying entities is also a key objective. Next slide, please. There are a set of principles that we use to guide our approach to fee setting. These all come from the OECD's best practices for charging fees for regulatory programs. And so I won't spend a lot of time on these. They're set out on the screen, but that OECD guideline sets out 9 factors that are important for implementing both effective and efficient fee systems. And I'm happy to try to answer questions about it if you have any. Next slide, please. There are some specific rules we're currently applying when we set fees. Number 1 is no proration. So fees are charged for the calendar year in which fees are paid. So as an example, even though the Blue Box and HSP registration deadlines are later in this year, not at the beginning of this year, there isn't any proration based on sort of when registration starts or when deadlines are. And in part, that just acknowledges that all of the work that needs to go into setting up and preparing for these programs to run on the RRCEA side. And that's been a principle that's been applied to all of the programs that we've implemented so far, tires and batteries and electronics. No in-year adjustments is another rule. So if there are adjustments to your fees, those get reflected in the calculation of the fees for the next year. And fees are applied to each program. So if you're a producer in the tires program and the HSP program, you'll pay 2 fees, 1 for each program. Next slide. So this set of bullets just sets out at a high level our methodology. I'm going to talk a bit, provide a bit more detail about it later on as well. But the starting point is RRCEA's annual budget. That needs to be allocated both to the registry programs, the RRCEA programs, and the WDTA programs. Then the registry budget or the registry expenses need to be allocated to each of the registry programs. And that incorporates both a direct cost to each program and each program's share of common costs. Then within each program, that program's budget needs to be allocated among the regulated parties who are obligated under that program. And then we need to determine the type of fee. So typically that's whether it's a fixed or variable fee. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, part of what we're doing in this consultation is sort of presenting the registry budget for 2021 and how it's allocated to each of the programs, each of the registry programs. The 2021 budget, I should say the 2021 registry budget has increased by about $2.3 million compared to what was published in the 2021 business plan. So every year RRCEA publishes a business plan that's finalized in September and posted on the 1st or 2nd day of October. And that gets published on our website, so you can go look at the 2021 business plan. We needed to increase our 2021 budget relative to the business plan because of changes to some of the assumptions that were underlying what we published at the end of last summer, I guess last fall. In particular, some of the assumptions that changed were about the blue box regulations. So after the business plan was published, we learned that the blue box regulation would be coming into force in 2021, which is earlier than expected. RRCEA is also being, after that business plan was developed, RRCEA was also directed to develop an excess soil registry this year, which is not one of our waste diversion programs, is a separate digital reporting service that will operate as part of the registry. In addition, we had to sort of account for, in addition to sort of increased delivery expectations, some of these changes meant that there would be a lot of overlapping projects in 2021 for RRCEA. So a number of new registry builds, as well as multiple registration and compliance campaigns, both for the two new programs, Blue Box and HSP, kind of happening at the same time, overlaid on top of our existing programs. So we needed to make sure our resourcing plans could accommodate all of that. That's why they were adjusted upwards. In particular, a lot of the resource growth that was planned for later this year and in 2022 to accommodate all the new programs, we thought we might get has been accelerated into 2021. That was a key contributor to the revised budget. Why don't we, Isabella, move over to the next slide. So the revised budget is presented there in blue. So the registry expenses or the revenues we'll need to recover from the registry programs are $9.67 million, which is an increase from what was in our published business plan. That is made up of both direct costs, as I mentioned earlier, and common costs. So in the green circle, you'll see the smaller pie is the direct costs. Those are costs that are directly charged to each program. They're specific to a program. And the bigger piece are the common costs, which get allocated through a program weighting method that I'll talk about in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So the way we allocate, so this is really how that green circle gets allocated to the program. So first is we apply our forecasted direct expenses to each program. So the key direct expenses, and again, that's the, for 2021, that's the smaller pie that was in the earlier screen. The key direct expenses for each program are the registry costs. We think of our registry costs right now, we think of them in sort of two components. There are the costs of developing that program's portal, right? So participants in the TIRES program, they access the registry through a TIRES portal that is specific to that regulation. The batteries and electronics producers and pros and service providers will be using batteries and electronics portal starting in August. Eventually we'll have portals for Blue Box and HSP. So the cost of that is allocated directly to each program, to the program that it relates to. All registry costs are amortized over 10 years. So the cost of the registry build is spread out over a 10-year period. The other component, the other direct cost component are the common elements of the registry. Those are the registry common elements that support common functions for all of our programs, things like account management, account creation, system security, and that kind of thing that are common and that we try to leverage across all of the programs for efficiency reasons. Those are foundational or common costs, and those get split up equally among all the programs. and charged to them as a direct cost. I'll talk a little bit more about how that works, I think, coming up on the next slide. That's the direct costs. Shared common costs are assigned to programs based on a program weight approach. And those common costs, incorporate all of the, or most of the salary and other functions that support the program. So not just the compliance and enforcement team, obviously, but all of the administration, communications, and finance pieces that support what we do. Next slide, please. Foundational costs. To date, the foundational costs or common elements, we sometimes call them, we've invested $4.7 million into the registry, into those components of the registry to date. So again, that gets amortized over 10 years, and programs begin paying their share of those common elements once they become active. So Tires has been paying its share of those common elements. Batteries and Electronics has been paying its share. Blue Box and HSP will also pay their share of those common elements starting this year. But it's divided equally. So at the end of the amortization period, all programs will, have paid their fair share. It's just a pace at which it gets recovered through your fees is different depending on whether you started earlier or later. There was a small portion of common costs that was allocated to the WDTA participants in 2018 and 2019, but it's that allocation finished in 2019. And so again, foundational costs will be equally divided among all the programs. Foundational registry costs will be equally divided among all of the programs, all the active registry programs this year. Next slide, please. The common costs, which was sort of the larger chunk of that green circle we saw earlier, gets allocated to the programs based on a program weight allocation, reflecting the level of effort and service needed for each of the programs. So the first registry program, Tires, serves as the benchmark, and so gets a program weight of 1. And then the other programs are scaled up or down relative to Tires, taking into account the number of producers, the number of regulations and the complexity of the regulations, and the effort required to oversee the different material categories and collection networks that are obligated by those regulations. So Blue Box gets a weighting of 3. It has substantially more producers, about more than triple the number of producers in the Tires program. Batteries and Electronics gets a weighting of 2. That program combines 2 regulations, which are linked in some way but different. So that in part justifies the program weighting of 2 for batteries and E. The HSP program is more complicated than Tires, in part because of the different material categories that are covered and the different requirements that apply to those material categories. So 2 of them, categories A and B, the programs for those 2 categories look similar to the kind of regulatory program that you see in Tires and in the Batteries and Electronics regulations. There are 3 other categories where the programs, although the obligations are reduced, they are different, and those also need to be resourced. And so that extra resourcing and complexity results in the program weighting of 1.5 for HSP. Next slide, please. So all of what I talked about results in these budget allocations for 2021 to each of the programs. So I think this information was in the material that we posted on our website. So if you need to refer to it, it's there. So these budgets are a combination of both the direct costs, including registry costs, and the share of the common costs. Next slide, please. Oh, so now we're at the end, sort of the first part of the presentation. So what I haven't done yet is present the actual Blue Box and HSP fee proposals. But I think we thought it would be helpful to sort of pause now, see if there's any questions about what's been presented so far before I get into the actual fee proposals.
Thanks, Noah. We do have two questions. They're both a bit more general, kind of speaking to the regulations more themselves. So I thought we could answer those now before getting into the fees. So the first one is, could you please elaborate on the definition of a producer for these regulations? And I think referring to maybe any of the regulations you mentioned before, and what type or what entities fall under that definition of a producer.
I would love to answer that question, but I think what I'm going to do is defer it. So if you are a producer, a potential producer, and you have questions about whether you're obligated under any of our regulations, you should contact our registry team, and you can reach out to them at registry@rrcea. And they can help you figure out whether you're obligated or not if you don't already know. I should probably warn you that for the Blue Box and HSP programs, you may get a bit of a holding message right now as we develop some of our compliance bulletins and common materials. So we have a consistent message for all the producers or potential producers we're going to be interacting with. But that's a key part of what we do is helping folks understand their obligations, and that's a function that's run by our compliance and registry team. I can maybe say at a high level, each regulation approaches it a bit differently. But there's typically always some kind of hierarchy involved, starting with brand holders at the top. So if brand holders of the obligated material are resident either in Ontario in some regulations or in Canada and others, the brand holder is the producer. There isn't a resident brand holder, then you kind of go down a hierarchy covering typically next to folks importing the material. Then if there isn't a resident importer, then the folks marketing material. And that's typically how our the producer obligation is structured in these regulations. But on specifics, please reach out to the registry team.
Thanks, Noah. Another, again, general question, but it does kind of speak to, sorry, not general, but I think they would also might benefit from following up with the compliance team, but I will raise it because it does kind of speak to requirements and if that has any impact maybe on them registering and or paying fees to us. So is it correct that there are thresholds that can remove the obligation to register? A producer needs to keep track of their waste, for example, but if under the threshold, the producer does not need to report.
That is true. So again, it's different depending on the regulation, but some of them do have exemptions. Some of the exemptions exempt someone from registration completely. Some of them exempt producers from certain obligations. So that's all of that is spelled out in each regulation. If you have questions about whether, if you're a producer and you have questions about whether you are exempt, then again, please reach out to our registry team. If you're a producer and you're required to register under the regulations, then you will pay a registration fee. So we'll get to the proposal, but what that is soon. But obviously, if you're exempt from registration, we do not apply a registry fee to you. Any other questions, Jess?
One other question here. So currently I report Blue Box to CSSA, Canadian Stewardship Services Alliance. How is this different to now report to RPRA?
Right. So right now CSSA is helping to provide services to Stewardship Ontario, which is the statutory organization that runs that currently runs the Blue Box program for stewards under the WDTA. RIPRA is under the new program, the new Blue Box program under the RRCEA. RIPRA doesn't run the recycling program. RIPRA is the regulator that makes sure everyone is fulfilling their obligations as set out in the Blue Box regulation. And those obligations are at a high level on producers to register and report to us and to meet certain performance targets or obligations with respect to both collection and management. And there are also some obligations on pros and service providers relating to reporting obligations, but also standards that regulatory standards that they have to meet. And it's RIPRA's job to make sure all those obligations are complied with. We do not RIPRA does not arrange for collection or recycling of end-of-life products, so that is all up to the producers to manage themselves. It's their responsibility under the RRCEA to determine how they will meet their obligations. Typically, producers are working with PROs, producer responsibility organizations, to meet their obligations and to meet their responsibilities. We do not, the fees we're collecting don't go to recovering the costs of implementing collection and management systems or any of the operations related to collection and recovery of resources. What RIPRA does is administer the regulations developed by the ministry and approved by the government to ensure that everyone is in compliance and that there is a level playing field for businesses when it comes to these resource recovery obligations. So I hope I've explained that clearly. But if not, feel free to ask a follow-up later on.
Thanks, Noah. That's it for questions for now.
Okay, so let's, so this part of the presentation, we're gonna look at the proposed fees for Blue Box and HSP. So Isabella, why don't we jump right in? Though I do like that colorful battery slide. Like with the tires and the batteries and e-programs, the proposed 2021 registry fees for Blue Box and HSP only include fees for producers. So we're not proposing fees for service providers or pros in 2021. The Blue Box and HSP fees use a variable and flat fee structure. So that's similar to how it works for tires and for batteries and E. There are some differences with the HSP fees, and we'll get into a bit more detail about later on, because of the different material categories involved in that program, because of the different kinds of obligations those material categories have. Next slide. This is the proposal for blue box fees for 2021. For producers that are supplying less than 100,000 kilograms of obligated material, they pay a flat $75 fee. That is the same fee that small producers pay in the tires program and the batteries and E program. Producers that are supplying more than or equal to 100,000 kilograms will pay a variable per kilogram fee, which is 0.38 cents a kilogram. And again, these fees are set in order to recover the costs that you saw earlier, to recover those expected program budgets. And so the fees are based on a set of assumptions about the number of producers and the amount of obligated material in the program. If you have feedback about these assumptions, we very much appreciate it if you think we're getting it right or wrong. But we're estimating a total number of obligated producers in the blue box program of about 1,800. A majority of them will pay the $75 flat fee. About 600 will be paying the variable fee because they're over that threshold. We're assuming about 930,000 tons of obligated material will get reported under this program. This slide, I'm going to move on, but this slide is also posted on our website because it was part of the initial material that we posted when we launched the consultation. Next slide. HSP fees, because of the different material categories and the fact that the programs for each category look a bit different, we have allocated the HSP budget among the different categories. So categories A and B, I said earlier, those two categories, the program for those two categories looks very similar. I shouldn't say very, it's similar to the typical regulatory framework that we see in tires and batteries and electronics. And they are allocated most of the budget for HSP. Categories C, E, and D have substantially reduced obligations under the HSP regulation. So they're allocated a smaller portion of the budget. Categories C and E, although their obligations are different, they both include some collection and management responsibilities. And category D, producers only have promotion and education obligations. In terms of performance, their performance obligations are only about promotion and education, not collection and management. And so the allocations of the HSP budget reflect the different level of effort associated with those, with ensuring compliance with those different programs. Next slide, please. So categories A and B, again, the structure of the fee is similar to what we saw with Blue Box and what, if you were looking, you would have seen with tires and batteries and E. So there's a flat fee for small producers under 10,000 kilograms. There's a variable fee for producers supplying more than or equal to 10,000 kilograms. For the other material categories, we're charging a flat fee to recover the cost of their programs. In part, that's because producers in those categories don't have to report weight to us on an annual basis. Again, you'll see at the bottom the assumptions we've made that are relevant to sort of matching up this fee proposal with the costs we need to recover. So for categories A and B, we're assuming a total number of about 225 total producers, 65 of them small, the others, and paying the flat fee, the others larger and paying the variable fee, with about 123 million kilograms we expect to be obligated under the HSP regulation. To support the flat fees for the other producer categories, you see our assumptions there about the number of producers we think there may be in those categories. Again, if you have feedback about any of these assumptions, we very much appreciate it. You know, these regulations are new to you, and they're also new to RRCEA, and so we're trying to do as much as we can to learn about the producer communities that are obligated. If you think we're getting some of our assumptions here are off, we do appreciate feedback about that. Next slide, please. So again, we're at the end of the substantive portion of the presentation, and another opportunity for questions.
Sure. The first one is actually a follow-up regarding that question about CSSA and reporting. So the follow-up is, do I have to report to both CSSA and RPRA and pay fees to both?
So that's a good question. You're obligated to report to RRCEA and pay RRCEA's registry fees. So that's an obligation under the regulation released by the ministry. And again, that has to do with RRCEA's role as the regulator, ensuring that everyone who is supposed to be, everyone who has obligations under the regulation is meeting those obligations. And then it's up to the producer how they want to go about and meet their obligations. Typically, producers enter into a commercial arrangement with a producer responsibility organization. So that might be an entity, might be CSSA or an entity like CSSA. But it's up to the producer how they want to meet the regulations under the new program. I should note, though, because of the long transition period for the Blue Box program, maybe this is what you were trying to get at earlier. The Blue Box transition is happening over a 3-year, well, longer than 3-year period, in part because you know, the program, the regulation is being implemented now, and so the RRCEA program is starting up now. Municipalities begin to transition to the new RRCEA program starting in 2023, and that also happens over a period of time. So the full windup of the Blue Box program won't occur until the end of 2025. So during that period, producers, well, stewards will still be obligated under the WDTA Blue Box program, and will have to do the same kind of reporting that they've been doing under that program as it winds up. At the same time, and so I think that is run by Stewardship Ontario, but from the steward perspective, I think you're interacting with CSSA as a service provider to Stewardship Ontario. At the same time, you will also have to register and report with RRCEA.
Great. Next question. For the proposed registry fees for Blue Box, is the 100,000 kilograms of paper packaging threshold refer to just paper packaging? Or does it include all materials reported currently to Stewardship Ontario?
So it actually includes all of the materials that are obligated under the Blue Box reg, which include the ones reported to Stewardship Ontario, but the Blue Box reg also obligates new categories of material, in particular, things like unprinted paper, packaging like products, some service accessories. So what the types of material that are obligated under the Blue Box reg are a bit different than under the old program. And so what you report to RRCEA under the new program will be different than what you reported to Stewardship Ontario. But if you have questions about that and how you will figure that out, again, please reach out to our registry team.
Next question here is, will we get steps on how to transition to RRCEA and the new framework and a recap of reporting obligations?
So the short answer to that question is yes. If you're speaking as a producer, we will be rolling out or launching a registration campaign for both new programs for Blue Box and HSP. And so the intention is for that to come along with guides and FAQs and hopefully compliance bulletins. So you will have reference material to help you figure out how to meet your obligations. So a key goal of that the compliance and enforcement team has at RRCEA is to do as much as we can to bring producers along into compliance. And that involves a big focus on communications, what we call communicating for compliance, or C4C. And so if you are a producer, you will be seeing communications from us about that. We are, again, still wrapping our heads around some of the details in these regulations. So if you haven't seen it yet, that stuff yet, that's okay. But we will be reaching out for you, and we're going to try to make it as the process as easy as we can, given what's set out in the regulations.
What if major retailers like Best Buy, Amazon report Blue Box waste? What is the producer's responsibility? So I think they're looking here for some clarification on who the producer would be.
So I think that question really goes back to the definition of producer under each of the regs and the hierarchy that's listed there. Again, at the top of that producer hierarchy is the brand holder for a product or a set of materials. Typically, if a brand holder isn't a resident in Canada, then you sort of go down the hierarchy list to the importer and then the marketer or retailer. So in some cases, retailers will be the producer under the regulation. In some cases, they may not be. So I'm pausing because I don't want to say anything wrong here. I think under the Blue Box reg, that sort of producer hierarchy looks similar to the, what stewards are obligated under the WDTA program, but don't quote me on that. so maybe what I should have said is that if you have questions about who's obligated, about whether you are obligated for material, please reach out to the registry team. Of course, you can always look at the regulations that are linked to on our website and posted and freely available online. But if after reading them, you still don't know, you can reach out to us.
Thanks, Noah. And our website itself also links to the regulation, but also provides a bit of a higher level overview of the definitions and materials that are obligated under all of the regulations. So you can look to our website as a starting point, and then again, more questions follow up with our compliance team. So this question here, it's a question with comment and context, so I'll read it all. While weight is one cost driver behind the Blue Box recycling system, it is not the main driver under the current SO formula, and is unlikely to be the main driver behind pro pricing. To put a point on that, the 2017 pay-in model highlights how paper's aggregated tonnage is 64.7%, but pays only 47.9%. Similarly, much later plastics weigh only 21.5, but pay 46.1 of system costs. This cost weight discrepancy is to reflect that curbside collection fills up based on volume of material and not simply based on a material density. A flat fee by kilogram harms paper at the expense of lighter weight materials. In addition, a flat fee is counter to the principle of extended producer responsibility, as easy to recycle materials generally have a higher density than hard to recycle materials. Would RPRA consider assigning the fee as a percentage cost increase on the bill rather than by 10? My quick math shows that the 0.38 cents per kilo fee equates to 3.2 increase to bills.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We part of the reason that our registry fees are based on weight is because that's what producers are obligated to report into us. And so that gives us an easy and efficient way to assign a variable fee for to producers. Another reason is that the weight-based approach to fee payment is consistent with the regulatory program as a whole that the government has mandated through these regulations, which are all focused on tonnage, both in terms of reporting and in terms of performance. And so the expectation is that performance is measured on a weight basis, and so having RIPR's registry fees paid on a weight basis is consistent with that. That said, we have looked at other ways of assigning fees, and we do have, a fixed fee component to how we assign fees. I'm not, it's not immediately obvious to me whether we could implement, how we could implement the kind of fee that, Sebastian, that you're suggesting in your comment. The fees we set, need to be based on information that producers are giving us. But we are happy to receive additional comments and proposals if producers, stakeholders have suggestions for alternative approaches to assessing the fee.
Next question, can our pro pay RPRA registry fees on behalf of our company, and then the pro invoices us with our regular fees?
So ultimately, that's up to the producer and the pro. So fees need to be paid through the producer's account in the registry. But the producer has freedom in terms of how it wants to manage its account. If the producer has that arrangement with the pro, that's fine with RRCEA. It's still the producer's obligation to make sure that the fee gets paid. So that's that can change, but the producer and the pro can sort of work out on their own the mechanics of how that gets done.
Next question here, again, it's quite specific to the producer hierarchy, and I think it would be best suited to follow up directly with our compliance team. So I can follow up with this individual afterwards, and we can send it.
Is that the question about if there's a outside Canada importer that you're looking at?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're right. So on that question, you should follow up with the registry team. I will say at a high level, that's correct. If there's no importer resident in Ontario, then in the typical hierarchy in these regulations, again, there are differences among them, then it's the retailer or marketer who's resident in Ontario who is obligated. But that's sort of very simplified answer to your question. So on the specifics, if you're a producer and you need to know what you might be obligated for, you can reach out to our team, or it's also fine to wait for us to reach out to you, because we will be reaching out to you.
Okay. Next question. At what point in the transition period can producers begin to shop for other pros besides Stewardship Ontario or CSSA or decide to become self-compliant, not working with a pro?
Right. So that depends on the timing in the regulation. So there's a question about Stewardship Ontario, maybe a question about maybe a blue box related question. Each regulation has timelines for pros to register with RRCEA. When a pro registers with RRCEA under the new program, we post it on our website. So there's a list of registered pros on our website. And producers can use that list to begin to find pros under the regulation. They don't have to wait for RRCEA to produce that list. But once you do sign up with a pro, that starts to generate registration obligations for the pro. And in terms of becoming self-compliant, again, that's up to the producer. From day one, under the new program, the producer can determine whether it wants to work with a pro or maybe contract directly with a processor for the performance services it needs. Now, in Blue Box specifically, again, because of the long transition period for the Blue Box program, there will be parallel obligations. So producers will still need to, or will still be stewards under the WDTA program, will need to be reporting into Stewardship Ontario. At the same time, they will start to have obligations under the RRCEA, and will need to figure out how they will be, what commercial arrangements they need to fulfill those obligations. I guess it may again be helpful to point out that under the Blue Box program, which is unique to Blue Box, there is rules creation process under the regulation that relates to how the common collection system will get allocated among producers. And producers may want to sign up with a pro in order to participate in that rules creation system. And there are specific deadlines in the regs for when that needs to happen by. So if you want to hire a pro to represent you in the rules creation process, there is a deadline in the reg. I don't know what it is offhand, but again, that's one of the things we hope to be communicating about directly to the producers or potential producers soon.
Thanks, Noah. Just confirming that the that deadline that you're speaking about, the rule creators, is between August 1st and November 1st is the rule creator registration process or timeline, sorry.
So I don't want to confirm that specific date because I don't trust my memory, and sometimes the dates in the HSP reg and the blue box reg get mixed up in my head, and I don't have them in front of me. But generally speaking, that so I think the rest of the comment says that you need to decide on a pro within the next couple of months. For the rules creation process, that's generally right. So may not be 2 months, it may be 3 months, but over the summer and into the fall, you will need to figure out if you want to arrange with a pro to represent you in the rules creation process.
And then just to follow up on that, this next question is, so the rule creation process aside, if you want to work with a pro on the collection and management side of things, do you need to confirm your pro when you register with RPRA in October? Again,
the short answer to that is I don't know. I think there's an obligation to identify which who is representing you for the rules creation process. Typically in the regulations, there's a deadline for telling us how you will be achieving your collection and management obligations. And so at that point, you would be telling us whether you're working with a pro to do that and which pro you're working with, because if you're working with a pro, it has to be a pro that's registered with us. I don't know offhand if when that deadline is, meaning the deadline for identifying the pro that will be doing the collection and management work for you. But again, that's a good question for our registry team. So hopefully I haven't confused things too much, but on Blue Box, there's sort of the pros are kind of serving two purposes. So one may be representing producers with respect to rules creation, and then also providing or helping to coordinate collection and management services for a producer. And so there's different timelines for that. The rules creation process is happening sooner, will get kicked off later this year. And so there is some deadline pressure there. The collection and management obligations don't start in 2021. So you have more time to set up those commercial arrangements. And those commercial arrangements themselves may depend on, how the allocation rules work.
This question here I can just speak to. Will you be sending out a copy of the presentation deck? Yes, we will. So following today's webinar, likely tomorrow, you'll receive an email. Anyone who registered for both webinars yesterday and today will receive a recording as well as the presentation slides. So right now, just take a pause quickly and we'll come back to questions. Go to the next slide, please. So just doing a really quick poll, something that we do in all of our consultation webinars, just to gather your feedback. We're always looking to improve and enhance our consultation webinars. So if you could please just take a couple seconds to complete this poll, and then we'll get back to the following slides. Okay. Thank you so much for participating. As if you have any further feedback you'd like to share with us, maybe some written feedback, feel free to send us an email at consultations@rpra.ca. Again, we're in the business of improving our sessions going forward, so please let us know if you have any feedback. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly go through our next steps on the next slide. So again, as mentioned, both this presentation deck and recordings of both today and yesterday's webinars will be posted to our consultation webpage. The consultation is closing on Tuesday, August 3rd, so you can send us your feedback via email to consultations@rpra.ca. Similarly, if you have further questions about the proposal or would like to discuss in more detail, email us at that same email address and we will get back to you. Also mentioned that I said at the beginning of the webinar that we will be posting a Q&A log from today and yesterday's webinar to our website, so you can see you can listen to the recordings, but you also can see them questions written out, and those will be posted in the coming weeks. Feedback will be summarized in a consultation report. This is something we always do, so that will be posted on our website following the approval and release of the final fees. And once that has happened and the fees have been finalized, stakeholders will be notified at that time. And then furthermore, as Noah mentioned several times, we will be communicating directly with producers of Blue Box materials and HSP on how and when they can complete their registration, reporting requirements, and paying their fees. So at that time, we'll be able to provide much more detail and guidance on what that process looks like, and when it's taking place. So stay tuned for that once the fees are finalized. So with that, there's another question here, Noah. So this was just so another point of clarification that there was the MECP, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, had a webinar on the Blue Box regs yesterday. They told the group that you do not have to identify a pro when you register with RPRA. So this person's just looking for a little bit of clarity there.
Right. So it's possible I managed to make things even worse during this session, which is probably why I should have said, well, the best thing is to talk to the registry team and email registry@ripra.ca. I can say that, so what you heard yesterday is correct. So the deadline for registering and reporting with RIPRA, I think, is either the end of September or the beginning of October for producers. The deadline for identifying whether you have a pro that will represent you as a rules creator is after that, I think a month later. So maybe beginning of November. The deadline for identifying what pro you want to represent you in the rules creation process. So that it is true that when you register with us, if you don't have a pro yet identified, you don't have to identify them. If you do have an arrangement with a pro to represent you in the rules creation process, then you do have an obligation to identify them to us within, I think the regulation says within 5 days of entering into that relationship. So I hope that provides some clarity. If it doesn't, again, please reach out to our registry folks, but we will be communicating with producers directly about the process, how to get registered and reported, and how to make sure that you are represented in the rules creation process if you want to be.
And you can visit our website as well. Our Blue Box producer webpage will outline any key dates there, as well as the pro page. So on, as Noah mentioned, the deadline that's on our website for producer registration is October 1st. And yeah, so the website is a good source of up-to-date information. So feel free to check there. And again, if you have any further questions or need some more clarification, that's when you can reach out to our registry team. But all the dates on our website are accurate and should hopefully provide some clarification. So with that, I don't see any other questions. But again, feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you have after this webinar. And I think we'll just say thank you. Noah, any final words?
No, thanks for participating. Again, we appreciate feedback on the fees proposal. And if you do have comments or feedback, it would be great to get it into us as soon as you can.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.